Hello and welcome to this session on the effect of gait aid use on walking and user safety in older people and older people with dementia. My name is Professor Keith Hill. I'm the chair of this session and I am from the Rehabilitation, Ageing and Independent Living, the RAIL Research Centre at Monash University. Today we will have three presenters and that will be followed by questions at the end. The first of our presenters is Associate Professor Susan Hunter. She is from the School of Physical Therapy at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Susan's research interests are falls and the rehabilitation of geriatric patients with a particular interest in the cognitively impaired older adult. And Susan will be presenting today on the effect of gait aids on walking in people with dementia. Our second presenter is Dr. Den Ching Angel Lee. Angel is a research fellow at the Rehabilitation, Ageing and Independent Living Research Centre at Monash University in Australia and is a registered physiotherapist. Angel's research interests are the prevention of accidental falls in older adults, physical activity and research to improve health and well-being of older people with dementia and their informal carers. And Angel will be presenting today on exploring gait aid use and user safety by older people with dementia. Our third presenter is Professor Helen DAWES. Helen is Professor of Clinical Rehabilitation at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and Helen will present on user stability and adherence to guidance on walking frame use in older people. So I will now pass over to our first presenter, Susan Hunter. Thanks, Susan.
So welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking about the effect of gait aids on walking in people living with dementia. So one of the first things to address is the extent of gait and balance impairments among people with dementia. We know that they are common in early presentations within the disease process. And that the annual rate of decline in gait and balance is greater for people with dementia than their cognitively healthy peers. It's also important to know that exercise has been demonstrated to be able to improve gait balance and lower extremity weakness in people with dementia. But even with participation in a rehabilitation program, there still may be balance and gait deficits. That is a bit of a problem because we know balance and gait deficits are risk factors for falls. And unfortunately, falls risk in people living with dementia is about 60–80%, or at least twice what it is for our cognitively healthy peers. So in that gap where there may be deficits, gait aids are prescribed to help offset these deficits and to facilitate independent mobility. So we know that gait aids improve the quality of walking in cognitively healthy older adults over not using aids. But amongst people living with dementia, falls risk is increased where for people who are using gait aids for their mobility. So there is a relationship between gait and cognition, in that walking requires higher order cognitive processing. And that's even for routine, simple gait activities. But we also have to consider that cognitive capacity is a finite resource. It's like the computer resources that we have, and there's only so much RAM or memory that is available on our computer. So that if we see cognition as a finite capacity, then it's possible for people who have dementia where that is decreasing, that the demands of performing complex tasks or multitasking, doing two or more tasks at the same time, can exceed the available cognitive resources for the person. When that happens, then performance on one or all the tasks that the person is trying to do will deteriorate. One of the common ways to measure the relationship between gait and cognition is looking to have people perform both walking task with a secondary task. And in that, we look specifically at what their walking is like, and we look at their walking alone when they're doing no other tasks. Most common measures that are used are gait velocity and stride time variability, which is a measure of gait stability. We can measure cognition alone. So we have persons sitting in a chair and we ask them to perform a cognitive task such as counting or verbal fluency tasks. And then we can look at how many responses they're able to give us within a set period of time, but also the accuracy of that response. Then we take those two independent tasks and we combine them together. And then we still measure the performance of both of those tasks while they're being done at the same time. And that the cognitive demand or trade-offs that have to occur to do those two tasks together looks at the difference between the single task and when they were doing the two combined. And that's considered the cognitive demand. And from this, we can get both a cognitive as well as a gait score, how much change happens in each of those individual tasks when they've been combined. As I mentioned, one of the common ways of testing for this is having people walk and talk at the same time. And if someone's cognitive resources are getting towards their capacity, then we can see that walking will slow down and people will become unsteady. They're talking, the cognitive task may also slow, and they may also perform more errors while they're doing the cognitive task. The other thing to look at is how do people prioritize the two tasks? If there is this competition between brain resources, do people let the gait task drop off more extent than the gait task, or do they flip it around? They let the gait task decrease more than the cognitive task. So we can look at how they prioritize competing activities. So when it comes to using a gait aid, well, what are the added cognitive demands? So we know that using gait aids does add cognitive demands, and we see that even in young, healthy adults. Quite a few studies have looked at adults in their 20s, and it still shows that there are demands of learning to use mobility aids. So we know that cognitive demands vary with task complexity as well as task novelty, and that the use of mobility aid adds to that complexity of walking where it requires higher order cognitive processing. And that's because we need to time motor sequencing and coordination between our walking and use of the aid. We need to have the person plan a path that they have to walk through their environment, as well as people need to be able to walk around obstacles. There can also be distractions in the environment that increase cognitive demands. That can be ambient noise, and it can be doing multiple tasks at the same time. So walking and talking, even carrying on a conversation with somebody else. There's also the person's added cognitive demands of thinking about the strategies of using their gait aid, such as when do I use my brakes? When do I have to slow down? How much space do I need to maneuver around obstacles? So for people who have dementia, the added challenges may happen at a point where their disease process doesn't have the available resources to do these extra tasks. So at the end of it, it's possible that contrary to the intended benefits of giving gait aids, people with dementia may experience instability and falls while using the mobility aid, for a large part because we've overtasked their cognitive abilities to use the aid appropriately. So I was involved in doing a series of experiments that actually were looking specifically at the effect of gait aids on walking with people living with dementia. And the first group of exercises was to look at people who were novice to using gait aids and that they didn't require the use of the gait aid. So this was being able to look at specifically what were the cognitive demands of learning to use a mobility aid. And so we recruited people who with mild to moderate severity Alzheimer's disease, and we compared them to cognitively healthy older adults. And we evaluated them for two different gait aids. The first was learning how to use a single point cane, and the second was learning how to use a four-wheeled walker. And in our testing protocol, we had people walking in a straight path and walking in a figure of eight, as outlined in the pictures below. And in each of those pathway configurations, we had the person just walk without using the gait aid. Second task was just walking, but we gave them the gait aid after we'd given them opportunity to practice and be taught how to use the gait aid. And then we did a dual task testing. So we had the person walk with the gait aid while they counted backwards by ones. And then we evaluated the performance of the gait and the cognitive performance. For the cognitive performance, we evaluated the person sitting in a chair with no other challenges or demands on them except having them count backwards by ones. So in our evaluation was to look at the difference in performance between the single task and the dual task for gait velocity. And in this, when we look at positive values, it means the person's performance got better in the combined activity. Negative values mean that they deteriorated. And then we can also determine task prioritization by looking at which of those two tasks deteriorated the most. So in the first study was looking to use a single point cane. And this first graph shows the 6 tasks that we had. So we had straight path, only walking, straight path, walking with the cane, straight path with cane and counting backwards by ones. And then we had the person walk in a figure of 8, only walking in the figure of 8, walking in a figure 8 with the gait aid, and then walking with the cane and counting backwards. So task difficulty increased as we go from left to right. The dotted line represents our controls, our cognitively healthy controls, and the black line represents our participants who had dementia. And then we can see that as the task difficulty increases from left to right, we can see that gait velocity decreased in both groups. Importantly as well, gait velocity was always slower amongst the people who had dementia compared to our cognitively healthy group. This second graph is looking at that stride time variability, which is a measure of gait instability. Higher values in this situation are a worse marker, whereas for gait, lower values are a bad marker. Stride time variability, high values are a bad marker. So we can see that there wasn't much difference across either group until they got to the most complex task, which was walking in a figure of 8, walking with a cane, and counting backwards by ones. These are the graphs that we can look at the cognitive demands and the performance demands. So we plot the difference between the dual task and the single task performance for both the gait as well as cognition. So the x-axis is gait, y-axis is cognition. People in this quadrant of the graph, where open circles represent people with Alzheimer's, dark circles are people who were the controls, we can see that majority of people in this study had what we call mutual interference. Their performance on both the cognitive as well as their gait task deteriorated, and they end up in this quadrant for walking in a straight path, and same thing, majority participants had this mutual interference when they walked in the figure of 8. Now, when we looked at which of these two tasks that people prioritize in the straight path, 65% of the people with Alzheimer's and 68% of the controls prioritize gait over the cognitive performance. So their cognitive performance decreased to a greater extent than their gait. This is considered a posture-first strategy. It's considered a very successful thing and helps to prevent falls because the people are putting what limited resources they have towards the stability, the actual walking task. In the figure of 8, we see that 47% of people with Alzheimer's and 68% of the controls prioritize gait. Still, posture-first strategy, but we're seeing that there was a switch. The people with Alzheimer's were not prioritizing gait to the same extent they did in a simple pathway, nor to the same extent as controls. Okay. So when we repeated the study, looking at people learning to use four-wheeled walker, we saw more or less the same effects. We saw that in both gait groups, gait velocity got slower with increasing complexity of tasks, and that people with Alzheimer's continued to walk slower than their cognitively healthy peers. For the stride time variability, we can see that people with Alzheimer's had higher instability than their cognitively healthy controls, and that, again, the more complex the task, the greater the instability, higher values being a bad marker. When we looked at the cognitive demands, we can see that majority of people end up in this bottom quadrant here, which says that there's mutual interference between the cognitive tasks and the gait tasks. So they deteriorated on both of these. But when we looked at task prioritization, in the straight path, none of the people with Alzheimer's prioritized gait over their cognitive performance. That's called a postural second strategy. And that's associated with an increased falls risk. Interesting part in our study was that when they went to the figure of 8 performance, that 75% of the people now with Alzheimer's prioritized gait over the cognitive performance. So they were able to switch to the posture first strategy, which is the safer approach. Our last study that we looked at was what happens or how much benefit do gait aids have for people who have dementia if they're already using them. So we evaluated people with dementia who were users of four-wheeled walkers, and we tested them in 3 conditions. We had them walk without their gait aid. We then gave them their gait aid back and had them just walk in a straight line. And then we had them walk with their gait aid and had them counting backwards by ones. Top graph here is for velocity. There was no statistically significant difference between their velocity when they didn't have their aid to when they had their aid. But when we had them then count backwards by ones, their gait velocity deteriorated. And in the stride time variability, again, there was no difference statistically between variability from not using their aid to using their aid, but the instability got worse when we added on the extra cognitive task of counting backwards by ones. So the important thing here is, at least for this sample, the gait aid didn't necessarily improve their velocity or stride time variability, but the important thing was that once we added a secondary distraction to them walking with their aid, their performance was worse than them walking without their aid. Definitely not a good marker, but it could help explain why people with dementia fall more often when they're using a walker. So summary, use of gait aids is associated with an increased risk for falls. And that learning to use a walker, such as a walker or a cane, is a cognitively demanding task. And what we don't know is how long do people with dementia require to actually learn the task and have the performance become a little bit more automatic. We know that for people with dementia who use a four-wheeled walker, the slightest little bit of a distraction will deteriorate the performance to the point that it's worse than when they walk without their walker. By report, people with dementia report feeling steadier when they do use the gait aid, something to be explored a little bit more. So that if there is a person, so main take-home points from a practical standpoint is if the person with dementia is considering use of gait aid, see someone who has experience working with people with dementia. That includes physiotherapists and occupational therapists. Benefit of exercise programs to address balance, gait, and strength problems. But very important that the timing, prescriptions, sizing, and training to use those gait aids for someone with dementia is very important. So you need to see somebody who has that experience. The last thing is that because of dementia is progressively, people's performance will get worse, they need to be assessed regularly to see if their gait aid is still appropriate. And that should happen at least once a year. So I'd like to thank my collaborators on my studies as well as my funders. Thank you.
Hello, my part for the symposium today is talking about exploring gait aid use and user safety by older people with dementia. And I'm going to explore this from informal carers' perspective. I will first like to acknowledge that this research was supported by the Dementia Australia Research Foundation, and all researchers declare no conflict of interest. Dementia can impact on a person's physical performance, and falls are an important indicator of safety risk and impaired mobility. The falls risk in people with dementia is much higher than people without dementia. For example, it is around 47% for Alzheimer's disease. It can go up to 90% for people with Parkinson's dementia, compared to 30% in people without dementia. Giving these people a walking aid or a gait aid, such as a wheel walker or a walking stick, is a common approach to improve their walking stability and independence in their walking. However, there is conflicting research about the usefulness of gait aid for people with dementia who are unsteady. On the other hand, a high proportion of people with cognitive impairment in the community are using walking aid. And also, research has found that many informal carers, such as family members, would consider using a gait aid for their care recipient who have dementia to help improve their steadiness in walking. So, in deciding whether a person with dementia who is unsteady should be using a walking aid or a gait aid is complex. And informal carers, for example, family members, are often the first line of people in investigating the use of gait aid for their care recipient. For example, they may talk to their doctor or health professional about the usefulness of using a gait aid for their care recipient, or they might just go and buy a gait aid from a shop or borrow it from a family friend or a friend. So it's really important then to explore and understand the perspective of informal carers in gait aid use by people with dementia and the factors that will affect their choices. The aim of this study was to describe informal carers' reports of current gait aid use by people with dementia, gait aid use when falls occur, and decision-making factor relating to gait aid acquisition, including the timing of their use, and to examine if differences existed between gait aid users and non-users based on the characteristics of the person with dementia, and if differences existed between fallers and non-fallers based on the characteristics of gait aid use. This study is an online survey that took place in 2020 to 2021. We surveyed adult informal carers who provided care to older people with diagnosed dementia living in the community in 2 states of Australia, Western Australia and Victoria. But the survey participants didn't have to have their care recipients to be currently using a gait aid to participate in the survey. We use a skip logic questioning style to design our questionnaire based on informal carer's choice as to whether the care recipient was using a gait aid or not. Most of the questions were closed-ended questions. And we asked questions based on 5 areas. So the first area is about the timing of gait aid commencement. The second area is asking about the care recipient's level of unsteadiness when they walk or turn, whether the gait aid was involved when they fell, where the gait aid was obtained, and whether they or their care recipient received advice about gait aid use at the time of obtaining their gait aid. We use Fisher exact tests to determine the differences between variables. So the difference, whether there's any relationship between gait aid users versus non-gait aid users, and the characteristics of people with dementia, such as their level of unsteadiness in walking or turning, their level of the degree of dementia severity, and whether they fell in the last 12 months. And fallers versus non-fallers with the characteristics of gait aid use, such as the timing of commencing gait aid use, whether it was before or after dementia diagnosis, whether they have received advice from a health professional when commencing use of their gait aid, and how regularly they were using their gait aid. We had 47 informal carers who returned the survey. Around 80% of them were aged 65 years or older. Around 80% were female, and on average, they were providing 6 years of care to their care recipient. For the care recipient, 62% were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. 70% were diagnosed with moderate or severe dementia. Around 60% had 2 or more falls in the last year, and 45% were rated by their care recipient to be moderately or very unsteady in their walking. 64% of care recipients were using a gait aid, and of these, 2/3 commenced using a walking aid after dementia diagnosis. And we can see that wheel walker is the most popular type of walking aid used by 44% of care recipients, followed by 30% using 2 or more types of walking aid, and then walking stick is around 26%. Gait aid use is most common in care recipients who have moderate dementia, so 61% versus 22% with severe dementia and 17% with mild dementia. And around 70% of gait aid users were not using their gait aid at the time of their fall, and less than 20% of gait aid users use their gait aid all the time. In terms of gait aid acquisition, we found that 25% of informal carers reported that the gait aid were obtained through non-health professional sources. For example, they borrow it from a family member or a friend. And 37% indicated that they or their care recipient didn't receive advice on how to use their gait aid when they obtained their gait aid. And 60% of informal carers reported some sort of deterioration in the use of gait aid in their care recipient after they were diagnosed with dementia. We found a significant difference between being a gait aid user and the level of unsteadiness in walking and turning. However, there were no relationships between being a gait aid user and being a faller in the last 12 months or with the degree of severity of dementia. And there were no relationships found between whether they were a faller or not in the last 12 months and the timing of commencement of gait aid use, whether it was before or after dementia, whether they received advice from a health professional when they started using the gait aid, or how regularly they were using the gait aid. So we can see that nearly 2/3 of people with dementia used 1 or more types of gait aid, and use of the gait aid was related to the level of unsteadiness in walking and turning. And falls often occur when the gait aid was not being used in those who had a gait aid. And less than 20% of people with dementia use their gait aid all the time. And 1/4 of informal carers reported obtaining the gait aid from non-health professional sources. And more than 1/3 did not receive advice on how to use the gait aid. So in addition, past research has shown common problems encountered with gait aid use, such as dual tasking. So dual tasking of walking and using the gait aid at the same time can compete for the user's attention so that the person with dementia may perform worse overall when they try to do both things at the same time. And difficulty in use or unsafe use of walking aid also pose a problem such that there are chances of the person tripping over or getting tangled up with the walking device. And intermittent use, non-use, or stopping use of gait aid are prevalent amongst older people who have gait aids. So our findings highlighted that there are a few things that we could do to improve this. For example, maximizing health professional involvement to offer gait aid training to teach people with dementia how to use a gait aid safely and correctly, and setting clear guidelines for situations under which a person with dementia should be using a gait aid, and considering the optimal timing of gait aid prescription. So in here, for example, if a person was already using a gait aid before the dementia diagnosis, then it will be worthwhile for a physiotherapist to regularly review gait aid and the use of gait aid after dementia diagnosis, and also designing interventions to remind gait aid use for people with dementia, such as using technological aid to provide these reminders. So in terms of future research direction, we could identify effective strategies that could reduce falls in people with dementia, and to work out ways how to educate informal carers to seek health professional advice when initiating use of gait aid, including as providing them with access to training on proper gait aid use, and to think about combining other strategies such as home safety evaluation and modification, and exercise to prevent falls for people with dementia. And we can also develop clear guidelines and to evaluate these guidelines for gait aid prescription and use for people with dementia that are tailored to the needs of people with dementia and also to their ability and capability. These are the references that I've used for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Helen DAWES. I'm going to talk about user stability and adherence to guidance on walking frame use in older people. I'm Professor of Clinical Rehabilitation at the University of Exeter in the UK. So in my talk today, I'm going to start off talking about some experimental studies on safe use of walking frames and user stability. And then I'm going to move towards factors affecting adherence and the safe and optimal use of frames. Just before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the funders who contributed to the studies that I'm going to talk about. So Dunhill Medical Trust, Stroke Association, Oxford Health BRC NHR, Fulbright, and the NIH. And this is work that's presented from the University of Salford, Drexel, and the University of Exeter. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start with a study which looked at using a walking frame and posed the question, are older people putting themselves at risk when they're using their walking frames? And this work was led by Sibili Thies and funded by the Dunhill Medical Trust. So a bit of background really, where we started from. And that's really noticing that fall-related injuries in older people are a major and growing global health problem. 40% of older adults, and this is now an increasingly large population, when they're living at home, experience a fall once a year. And in care homes, this is even higher. And as we know, falls can cost a lot of money because of both societal, the individual, and also the economic cost. Walking aids tend to be issued to older adults to prevent falls, but we also know that actually using a walking frame puts you at greater risk of falling too. So in this research study, Sibili Thies and colleagues set out to investigate adherence to guidance on walking frame use and quantify user stability when using walking frames in a home setting. So I'm going to start off with the methodology that we used. And you can see here we used an instrumented walking frame that was developed by the University of Salford. And within that, Its uniqueness was it can measure pressure and in the insoles of the shoes, so of the feet, so of the individual walking. It has a camera that can track where the feet are in relation to the walking frame. And it also can track through load cells in the front and rear legs the amount of weight that an individual is putting through the frame. And this is a really unique piece of equipment, which meant that we could look at a base of support, but the combined base of support from the frame and the individual, center of pressure of the individual, which we know is related to a person's balance and stability. And we also were able to calculate stability margin. So the method looked at, as you can tell, it's quite intensive testing. 17 older people who were asked to walk in both a lab setting and also in a home environment. And in this here, you can see in the video, we've got lab setting on the left. It's a home ADL lab at the university. And then on the right, there's a space in the lab where we can also carry out testing. And this is all carried out at the University of Salford. And what was explored was the times that the frame feet were airborne. And that you can tell from the load cell, whether actually any weight is going through that particular leg. Times from the individual's pressure insoles when the individual has got one leg on the ground, single, or two legs on the ground, dual support. And then adherence to the guidance. So we used standard guidance for both walking with a pickup walker, where you're meant to lift the frame and then move, put the frame down and move your feet, and not lift the frame when you're actually walking. And then a front wheel walker, where you're meant to glide the frame and not lift the front wheels. And then during this testing, we were able to develop a data analysis for stability of whether individuals were correctly or incorrectly following the guidance for using a walking frame. Okay, so what did we find? We found that incorrect use was observed for 16% of single support periods, so that's when an individual is on one leg, and 29% of dual support periods. So this just meant really that individuals were not using the frame as it should be. So this is the individuals mapped out here with the group average at the end, and it's got on the y-axis incorrect use, and then the darker bar is single support, and the grey bar is dual support. So you can see there's lots of variability between individuals in how they walked, with some individuals walking in a much more correct way than others. But you can see this individual here in dual support 70% of the time was incorrectly using their frame. And this here is a front wheel walker. So this is using front wheel walker. What we're able to observe as well, and this is really important, was that they were more likely to walk incorrectly when individuals were in more difficult constraint environments, so manoeuvring around a chair, manoeuvring forward or backward. Okay. Here, this is the data from the loading cells on the frame, and on the left hand side here it's in single support, and on the right hand side dual support. And this is the average device loading for correct and incorrect use during the single support and dual support. And we can see that device loading is reduced during incorrect use, i.e. if you're meant to have your weight on the frame at a time during single support, there was less weight going through the frame, suggesting that one or both wheels of the frame were being lifted off the ground. And we can see the similar pattern really for for incorrect use during dual support as well. So, but that's quite a nice set of data that gives us an indication of how individuals are mobilizing. Okay, so the third slide here from that data set is a data set from the same testing, and we looked at the stability margins. And this here is shown on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, we can see single support for the pickup walker, single support for the front wheel walker, and for the front wheel walker as well, dual support. And you can see the two testing environments, so both the ADL and also in the lab, and where we looked for correct and incorrect use. And again, you can see the stability margins in incorrect use, the individuals are less stable. And this held true across both types of walking frames and also in both environments. Okay, so from this data set, current guidelines for frame use were developed, and if individuals, if in the audience are interested, you can find these on this website here, which shows various guidance for front wheel walkers, pickup walkers. But I think the point I want to raise here, that the evidence for this is based on quasi-experimental cross-sectional studies, and that really there is a need for future research to take this a little bit further. So we're not going to just look at safe use as we have already, which has certainly guided individuals on how they should walk, but actually now to start thinking about safe and optimal use and effective training, hopefully to inform improvement of best practice. Okay, so coming back to where we started at the beginning of the talk, most falls occur when the frame isn't being used. And as we know, also when the frame is being used, individuals fall as well. But what we thought here is we'd think a little bit more as we move forward about why frames are not being used. And I'll just take us back a step here and think about walking, and walking when you're getting older. So walking gets harder as you get older, because as you age, it's just generally less efficient. And this takes you more effort, and it all feels harder. And this is both physical and cognitive effort to move around. So, and there's lovely studies that look at when you do two things at once, walking and thinking, or walking and talking, you stop walking. So this is something that's just reflective of the aging process. Have to think a little bit more about what you're doing, and as a result of that, it gets harder, and then you tend to do the activity less. And then you get in this cycle of deconditioning where it feels even harder and that you walk even less. So putting that in the context of walking with a frame, for those of you who've used it, it's even harder still, which seems a bit tautologous, because often we're giving frames to individuals who find it hard to walk. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is because you're moving slower, so you can't take advantage of natural walking efficiencies when you move at the correct pace, but also it's harder because you have to think more. And as we've just said, there's instructions for walking with frames where you're meant to have both feet on the ground to lift a pickup walker, or if you're moving with a wheel frame, you're meant to wheel the frame and then step to the frame, but not lift them all at the same time. So as a result of this gets us to the fact that people don't tend to use frames, especially when it's tricky to maneuver, like getting in and out of the toilet, or on and off a bed, or on difficult furniture. And so we're quite interested to take this forward. And the methodology moving forward that we want to explore, and we already have done in individuals walking without frames, and older individuals and individuals with stroke, is to look at measuring the systems and bolting this into the measurement system that we have with the frame already. So we want to look at brain activities for the sensory motor system, spinal cord activity. So you can see On a younger model here, we've got measurement of brain activity and older nervous system, and the reflexes in the leg here. But we've also got measures now that we can put to get more detail, both on the centre of mass of the individual to look at the movement of the centre of mass, but also on the foot to look at foot clearance and movement. And that way then we can start to look at individuals with frame users in a hierarchical model, really, of feedback and feed forward from the systems that we've just talked about. And here we've got, if you like, the measurement systems that we want to put on the back here, which will measure the centre of mass, but also on the foot here. And we can see here, by measuring that, we can actually start to see how well the foot will be cleared off the ground and how much the foot will push off, and whether individuals are getting their heel down or dragging their toe, which makes them likely to trip. So we're starting to get a little bit more information, and we're going to put this together with the frame set. So we can look at both the centre of mass and whether individuals are lifting their feet. So we're starting to combine measures together, and this data set has come together whereby we can look at both the effort of moving, so how hard it is, so we can measure that with looking at brain effort using the NIRS, and we can also look at physical effort using heart rate as well. So we can look at both the cognitive performance and physical performance. And then if we put those together, we can look at performance alongside effort, and then we can get a kind of efficiency score of how hard somebody's working and how well they're performing. And this here work was performed by Sean Dorsey and Hassan Ayaz and Thomas Ward. And here I'm going to just show how we have already carried this out using individuals with a wheelchair. And this methodology now, where we've measured the brain activity to think of the cognitive effort, the heart rate for the physical effort, alongside how well they perform, how well they maneuver the chair, so their actual performance, and how safe they are in the chair, doing certain activities. So what we're now going to do is take this methodology forward and start to bring it to enable us to look at individuals in a frame and to look at not only their safety when they're using the frame, but also the physical effort and the cognitive effort when they're using the frame. So then the next stages of the study are really to bring this together with frames, to try to unpick the question of why people don't use their frames, and to start to explore how we can make it easier in terms of physical effort and also cognitive effort for an individual to use their frame. We're going to use this facility here where we can create real and virtual environments of manoeuvring in a safe space, and we can map out an individual's own home as well to explore this, to determine safe and optimal use, and then to explore factors affecting safe use, optimal use, and adherence as well. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to my talk, and thank you to all of the contributors to the research that I've just talked about. Thank you.
For a very informative session. We encourage anyone to continue to add questions to the chat if you have any. We have had a question from Rosha Alexandra to Susan Hunter. The question was, do you have any data on people with dementia that have already used the gait aid before their cognitive decline?
And unfortunately, no. And it became a factor that we realized would be a very important area to consider. Because there is this belief that if they have learned it prior to their diagnosis, that there will be better maintenance of performance as the dementia diagnosis comes on. But that is something that would be very interesting to look at compared to people who newly start using the gait aid. And that timing of use is probably a really important factor in their performance and maintenance and long-term stability over time.
Great, thanks, Susan. We do have a couple of other questions that have come in. Rosha Alexandra has added another question to Helen Dawes this time. Dr. Dawes, do you plan to work with three-wheel walkers in your studies going forwards?
The initial plan is two-wheel walker, four-wheel walker. But we are also exploring other walkers. So yeah, that would, I think, be really interesting. We're also exploring a novel device that has been made, which has a different design as well.
Thank you, Helen. We have a question from Cooper Ingeborg. Thank you for the great lectures. The question seems to be a general one. Is dual tasking while using a walking aid something that can be trained in patients with not too severe cognitive impairment, such as people with mild cognitive impairment or early dementia? Who would like to have a go at that?
I'll have a go. There is a case study that has been published that did look at that, but their evaluation didn't actually look at the person's physical performance. So it didn't look at gait, didn't look at balance to be able to evaluate how well things change from beginning to end. That is definitely an area that is worth exploring to see if that is a means to help facilitate training for sure, and something that would be very interesting to be able to do.
And Helen, you've got an answer as well, have you, with your hand up?
Yes, but I didn't know about that study, Dr. Hunter. That's very interesting. We did a study where we looked at training not with frames, but just walking with people with stroke, following stroke. We looked at training with dual task and training without. And we found that people who couldn't walk at a level that was community walkability found it very difficult to train dual task at the same time as mobility and didn't get the same benefit. So I think it's a really interesting question as to what is the best approach. It looked like from that data, certainly after stroke, it was better to get the walking going first and then introduce the dual task training in those who are less mobility able. But that's the only evidence that I know about that might be translatable, but it's nothing, it's not a walking frame or device. So.
Thanks, Helen. I have a question for all of you, as that's the last of the questions from the audience, but I encourage the audience to keep putting questions in the chat if you have them. Susan, one of the points you were making was that slower gait using a frame is a worse outcome. It indicates poorer performance. I would argue that with some of my patients that slowing their gait down might be a better outcome. Does anyone have any thoughts on whether gait speed is, a slow gait speed is the best outcome or is a worst outcome, sorry? Susan first.
So I will qualify in that performance decreased.
Yeah.
I would say it is at this point debatable as to whether that is a worse outcome, but at least for the people with dementia, it showed that we were taxing them, that was the consequence of having to do the task that they weren't even able to maintain their level of performance. So in that sense, it was detrimental. But does it lead to better stability? The markers say no for that. But yeah, that one's open.
Variability.
Yeah.
The gait aid variability measure that you were also showing there is a much better indicator of poor performance or risk.
Yeah.
Than gait velocity.
Yeah.
Thank you. Angel, you were some of the data that you showed us had that consistency of gait aid use was a fairly big problem, and I think only 20% of the people in your sample were using their walking aid when they fell. Do you have any comments about that, and whether you feel that a training program may be of benefit in trying to increase that, whereas most often what we do is we just provide a gait aid without much sort of training?
So I would just like to clarify that in our survey, 73% of the gait aid users were not actually using their frame at any time at the time of the fall that occurred. So, these people, so there's a large proportion of people that should have been using a gait aid and fell, who were not. And less than 20% of gait aid users were using their gait aid all the time. I think it's a common problem across older people who were using a gait aid, not just in people with dementia, that non-use or intermittent use or stopping use of a gait aid is a problem. So I guess developing and investigating guidelines to guide the gait aid users when and how and under what conditions they should be using a gait aid is important. But I know that gait aid use can be also limited by the environment and the person choices. So these guidelines need to take consideration of these aspects as well. People with dementia have different capabilities and ability, and their balance performance differ. So I guess it will be good to have some protocols or guidelines on how much gait aid training should be provided to people with dementia. So at the moment, we are doing a study of looking at whether a longer training program to teach these people how to use the gait aid would be useful or not. So the study hasn't finished yet, but we are seeing some positive trend in people giving positive feedback about the longer duration of gait aid training program, and these people are often it can also maintain people using gait aid for a longer time, because we did a follow-up at 12 weeks, and most people are still using their gait aid safely. So, yeah.
Thank you, Angel. So I might just finish with a brief statement from one of the findings of Susan's presentation, and that was that even though overall there was a cost to using a gait aid, that a moderate proportion of the people with dementia were able to use their gait aid, prioritising gait first, but a moderate proportion were not. And so what we do need is systems to be able to try to identify those who are going to be able to successfully use a gait aid. So with that, I'd like to thank our three speakers and thank all of our contributors to the session. Thank you all.